Alrighty, guys. So in our last class, we talked a little bit about ecological footprints. We talked about human effects on the environment. And so to that end, I want to introduce a concept called the tragedy of the commons. And this has been used as a way of explaining why a lot of environmental degradation happens. And to sum it up before I say anything else, it is basically a way of understanding why people will take a short-term gain over long-term benefit. All right, and that's the idea. It's like, well, wait, we know that the environment is important. Why are we doing these things that are so bad just to turn a profit for the short term? And the whole idea behind that is this concept of the tragedy of the commons. So if you look over in the corner over there, what you'll see is a picture of a field. Looks pretty barren. It's bare grass, and you get this cow desperately trying to find some food. And that actually pertains to this. I'm going to show you how. The idea of the tragedy of the commons comes from Garrett Hardin. All right, he argued that the main difficulty in solving environmental problems is the conflict between a short-term interest and a long-term welfare to society. The example he used was this concept called the commons, which was an area of land that belonged to a whole village, and people would graze their animals on this common land. It was in the best interest of one person to put as many of their own animals on that land as possible because they didn't have to pay for the upkeep of the land. It just kind of took care of itself, and that's the idea there. However, the problem is though, if everybody thinks that way and everybody says, I really just want one more cow on the land, and everybody thinks, well, I'm just adding one cow, and what difference is one cow going to make? Pretty soon everybody there has added that, and that's doubled or more the size of the herds that are on there. All right? And if too many animals graze on this common ground, they're going to eat all the grass, and once the grass is destroyed, everybody will suffer because no one can raise any more animals on the commons. Well, the thing is, though, his point was that the land or any resource, if it's not managed, if you don't have limits placed on it, like, for example, the cartoon right over there, which is about fishing, all right, like catch limits in fishing. You're only allowed to fish so many fish at a time or something along those lines. His point is that if it's not managed, it would be quickly depleted. He argued specifically in his essay that private ownership is the only way to achieve this. The idea being that you take better care of your own house than you do public spaces. For us, that would mean like classrooms or parks. You go to public parks, you see sometimes people leave their trash out, or you go to a public restroom at a park, it's like, oh, people write on the walls and it's gross in there and those kind of things. But people wouldn't keep their own bathroom in their own house that way. They'd want to clean it up. They'd want to take care of it because they have to live with it. They're stuck with it. All right. He was partially right. He was only part right on this because it turns out that when you had an agreement and you had these commons, which people would be living next to for a long period of time, they did actually take good care of it. Eventually what happened though is that the commons were divided up into small individual plots, but the problem was people who had more money, they would put as many cows on there as they could, get the most profits they could quickly, and then when the land went bad, they'd sell it off for other use, like houses or whatever, and then buy up the land from another farmer and just do the same thing over again. And this is exactly what we've seen happen in the environment. The thing is, you can apply that to modern commons and natural resources. So think our forests, think our prairie land, things like that. And we actually have different governmental organizations that are designed to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Big companies coming in, clearing the land completely, getting as much profit out of it as possible, and then immediately just turning around and selling it. Even if they sell it for less than what they bought it for, they got all those resources out of it, and they turn it into something other than what it was naturally. All right. Think of a forest that could be cut down, all the timber sold, and then the land is sold to become a new subdevelopment or housing complex or something like that, a new theme park, whatever. Humans that live in societies, and as societies, we can solve these problems, but we have to work together. We need planning, organization, and forethought. We need scientific evidence, and we have to think ahead on this. So, for example, we have the U.S. Forest Service, which, again, you can see right over there, all right, their logo on the bottom there. Um, what the Forest Service does is they do allow logging. In national forests, you are allowed to cut down trees, but you have to get a permit to do so, and you're only allowed to cut either certain trees or certain amounts of trees. All right, so we need wood and we need timber for the purposes of building and stuff like that, but in order to make sure that we'll have timber and lumber products in the future, what we do now is say, well, you can only take trees that are damaged. You can take trees that are going to die soon. You can only take this many trees. You can only take trees if they're of this certain size. And by doing that, we don't take the whole forest. We only take parts of it, and then we let the forest regrow, heal itself, and grow new trees. The solution may be to override short-term interests of an individual or a company. When I say individual, I might mean a company as well, and improve the environment for everybody in the long run. We want to keep our national forests around. We want to continue to have an option to have timber and wood products in the future. We also want to have those forests for other benefits that they provide, cleaning the atmosphere, habitat for animals, all kinds of stuff like that. The problem, though, sometimes can be who's in charge of this. And this has resulted in the founding of many conservation groups and government agencies as a result. The Bureau of Land Management is another big one, especially here in Arizona. They control large portions of Arizona land, and they dictate who can do what with that land, grazing, mining, and other things. Okay? This also assigns a dollar value to these because a permit costs money to do this. So in some ways, this is also a source of tax revenue, essentially. This is money that the government can get by selling resources on land that it owns, and that means that you don't have to pay as much in taxes, which could be a good thing also. And then this leads to this point here for economics, supply and demand, all right? The general relationship between the two is the more demand there is for a product, all right, the more you can charge for it, all right? The smaller the supply is, the higher that demand is going to go. So as supply goes down, as something becomes more rare, people are going to want it more, and that price is going to go up. So to illustrate that, the law of supply and demand is a law of economics that states that as demand for a good or service increases, the value of that service will also increase. The example for this is the world copper production. So if we look at copper production over the past, over this 20-year period, you see that the purple here, the amount of available copper, dropped sharply. The amount of copper that was available to be used went down. This doesn't mean the copper ceased to exist. It just means that a lot of the mines that were producing it stopped producing. They ran out of ore to extract out of the ground. Another problem with this was increasing environmental regulation made it impossible to mine in places where we had previously mined, and as a result, the value of that copper went way up. I actually remember this. Now, the value of that copper's gone back down as some new mines have opened and mining has resumed in certain places. But I remember this in the mid 2000s. I remember it because I knew a couple of people that actually had their air conditioners partially stolen. People took the cowling, the cover off of their air conditioner and pulled the copper wire out of there because the price for copper went up enough that stealing copper actually became, you know, lucrative enough for people who were willing to steal. And it's one of those things where that was something that was happening. So to figure out this stuff, we have these things called cost-benefit analysis. So one of the things we have to do when we talk about the environment is to figure out what is the cost going to be. How much does it cost to extract that copper, and how much damage are we going to cause the environment? Because environmental damage is a cost as well. Ultimately, in the end, you're going to have to pay to clean that up. You're going to have to remediate that problem. So the cost of environmental solutions can sometimes be very high. It can sometimes be really expensive to do things like fill in an old copper mine or install pollution control devices on factories and things like that. So that's a reason why some businesses don't want to do it. The cost benefit analysis balances the cost of an action against the benefit we expect to get from it. How does a company benefit from controlling their own pollution? Do they benefit directly from it? They may not. There might be a long-term benefit for society, but the individual company may not benefit from it. The most benefit sometimes that they'll get is, well, we can maybe get some good policy stuff out of it, some good public perception. So what we have to do is sometimes impose an actual real cost on them. If it's going to mean that public health goes down and the government has to pay way more in Medicare and Medicaid in 50 years, all right, how about we charge the companies an extra tax if they pollute? And that's the idea behind some of this. The results depend on who's doing the analysis. So right here, pollution control may be too costly for an industry, but to a nearby community, that price might be worth it. Unfortunately, oftentimes the environmental regulations are passed onto the consumer or onto the taxpayer. So right here in our community, in our state, we face this right now. Just a few years ago, there was a vote that was proposed for the state to put in a huge amount of money to develop more renewable energy. And the idea here is that we would phase out all of our fossil fuel stuff, coal, oil, natural gas, power plants, and things like that. And what we would do is we'd put a huge amount of money in as subsidies to make sure that we have more solar, more wind, and, well, basically that's about it. There's more solar and wind, really. Um, so that was a plan that was proposed on a ballot measure. This was actually, on the election. And the thing is, it got defeated because people looked at it and said, well, wait, this is going to raise my taxes. This is money that's going to be diverted away from stuff like schools, and it's going to be taken from other places. There's no way we can do this in the budget without having to cut something else unless we really raise the taxes. And people decided, you know what? That price isn't worth it. The funny thing about it is, after that happened, one of the biggest coal-fired power plants in the nation, which was right here in Arizona, shut down. And it didn't shut down because of regulation. It shut down because in order to keep it efficient, in order to make it generate money, they were going to have to invest a huge amount of money into this thing. They were going to have to invest a lot just to keep the plant running because it was getting old. So they made the decision, well, the cost of rebuilding this plant is too high for the benefit that we're going to get out of the amount of money we're going to make, and they shut it down. And now they're exploring the idea of building a large solar and wind farm facility in that same area. So that's a cost benefit analysis, and interestingly enough, in this case, it swung towards the more sustainable solution being the better benefit. All right, so let's take a look at one or two more things for this. So what we have to look at when we're talking about a cost-benefit analysis is something called a risk assessment. And a cost of any action is the risk of an undesirable outcome. Risk assessment is a tool that helps us create cost-effective ways to protect both our health and the environment. Okay? So when we look at this chart here, if we want to look at that, you can see that you have the severity of what could go wrong and how likely that is to go wrong. So if you have a low chance of something going wrong, and if it does go wrong, it won't be that big a deal, you've got a considerably low risk, in which case it's a fairly safe action to take. Okay, if you've got a severity that's much higher, okay, that is not great if it does go wrong. Even if you have a low risk, you might not accept that consequence there, all right? But then you go the other way. How likely is it that something could go wrong? And then how bad will it be if it does go wrong? All right? And we can actually apply this to what's going on with our schools right now. Okay? Right now, you and I We're learning. We are teaching. I'm teaching. You're learning. Hopefully, you're learning remotely because of a risk analysis. It was deemed that it might be too risky. The severity of what might happen if we go back to in-person instruction might be too high for it to be worthwhile. All right. So if we look at the outcomes of us spending a quarter where we learn like this, possible risks. It's harder for me to teach. It's harder for you to learn. Grades might not be as good. Those are all risks. On the other side, risk of infection. How likely is it that somebody's going to get sick? How severe is that sickness going to be? Who's going to get sick? What does that mean? All right. And we're already seeing this, and we're seeing debate on this right now. Congressmen from Arizona are honestly pushing to try and get us back in the classroom right this minute. Just no, I know you've already made your decision. I don't care. Just get back in there. All right. But we already saw that happen in Georgia, and they thought the likelihood would be low, but it turns out a bunch of students just after a few days in school already have gotten the novel coronavirus. So it turns out this likelihood was very high. Now, we don't know what the severity is going to be. Even a low severity, this could be a problem though, because a bunch of people having that, even if they're just a little sick, even if it's just they don't end up in the hospital. When you're sick, it has just as much of an effect on your learning and your education. So you're ending up with the same kind of risk. Okay, well, what if there is a greater danger to your health than what's originally estimated? We already know that this likelihood is higher than what was thought. What if that's a much higher risk? Okay, and a lot of this discussion is about what about the kids? What about the kids? What about the kids? And that's fair. That is totally fair. But what about the other side of it as well? What about me? Okay, I'm not a kid. I'm older than you. I have a higher risk of getting horribly sick. My risk assessment matrix might be different from your risk assessment. All right? And this is where the previous statement comes back into play, where we look at it and we see, it depends on who's doing the analysis. The risk may be acceptable for someone who doesn't have to go to school, who's never going to set foot in a classroom, who's an elected official who has been conducting business entirely behind closed doors and over the internet for the past, what do we have to, 8 months now? Not naming names. I'm not naming who this individual is, but they work here in Arizona. Their risk is low. They've got money. Me, if I get sick and I have to spend a long time recovering from that, I have my son I have to worry about. I have bills I have to pay. I have you guys that I do worry about. I worry about your instruction because believe me, if I get sick, I'm going to still try and teach you guys. So that right there are differences in risk assessment. So when we're talking about the environment, oh man, it gets even crazier because now we have to balance risk assessment for, hey, what about the people that live in the area versus the people that are benefiting from it maybe somewhere else? And that's where we get to modern globalization. Okay. Here's where we finally get to modern cases of social justice and things like that. This is a really complex issue, but I'm going to give you a rundown really quickly. The unequal distribution of wealth and resources around the world has influenced environmental problems, all right, and solutions also that society can make. The United States has more money, bluntly, to throw at fixing an environmental problem. Do we do that? Not always, but we have the ability to if things go horribly wrong. Developed countries are countries with higher income. Your average person makes more money, all right? They generally have slower population growth. Your average family has fewer children. Diverse industrial economies, lots of different jobs that can be done, all right? You can, work in a factory. You could be a farmer. You could be a doctor. You could be a lawyer. You could be an entertainment guru. You could be a YouTube star. Well, maybe not me, but you get what I mean. And they generally have a stronger social support. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Let's see, what else is there? Access, access here in Arizona, and more. All right, as well as generally higher impact on the environment. Okay, so when we did our human footprint thing. Remember how we all had those high footprints, how it took several Earths, and we said that if people lived like us, we'd have a much higher risk. Well, we are a developed nation. We use more resources. We consume more, so we have a greater impact on the environment. Developing nations, nations that are less developed economically, are going to have generally more agricultural-based communities, rapid population growth, and a lower level of consumption and a smaller impact on their own. However, because of globalization, in a lot of these developing nations, there are large companies from developed nations going there and extracting resources causing environmental damage. So throughout Africa, there's a number of resources and materials. So in North Africa, you've got oil that's being extracted by American and British and European companies. In India, classified as a developing nation, although they're coming up in the world very rapidly, you have coal and natural gas and timber that are being cleared by other interests. Um, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a number of mines that mine for gold. Maybe you've heard of conflict or blood diamonds. And there's a metal out there called tantalum. Tantalum is a metal that is a semiconductor, is absolutely vital for making circuit boards, and it is the only way that your phone would work. It is a material that is necessary in order to get the microprocessors that go into your phone to work. The people that live there are mining it, but they're mining it for you. That is how you have an uneven distribution. And in these countries, there is not the environmental regulation that requires mining companies to repair the damage they do afterwards. There are not the health and safety regulations that require that workers be provided with breathing protection so they breathe in dust and get sick from that. So this unequal distribution of wealth, countries with more money purchasing and using the abilities of countries with less money, is leading to an uneven distribution of this, an uneven distribution of environmental impact. So here are the key things that you need to take away from what I just discussed. First off, I want you to be able to describe the tragedy of the commons. All right. What is it? General idea that it is people act in short-term interest to the detriment of long-term health of society. All right. I want you to be able to explain the law of supply and demand. As supply goes down, demand and price will go up. All right. So they're inverse of each other. Inverse, opposites. All right. And lastly, I want you to be able to list some key differences between developed and developing nations. Developed nations generally have higher individual incomes, robust economies, and a greater level of consumption, while developing nations, generally speaking, will have a lower level of industrialization, lower personal income, and oftentimes a lower individual environmental impact. So citizens there will have a lower ecological footprint. All right. Those are the key things that I want you to take away from this. All right. And that will actually be everything that we're covering in chapter 1 of this class. So we'll do some review, and then it'll be time for the first test. But these are the things that you want to review. You should be able to go back and double check if there's anything you're unsure of. All right, guys, see you soon.